evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. I'm Ryan Backmann, founder and executive director of Project Cold Case. We've got a very special guest here with us today. This is Tom Brady.
Yeah, hi Ryan.
Super Bowl MVP.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in Jax for a quick help out.
I know you get that all the time. That's got to be old because
it's never old.
Never old. It's never old being
Tom Brady's.
Tom Brady.
Likeness, I guess. Name only.
Yeah, I like to do a lot of research for our guests and know who I'm talking to and be able to explain some history and I'm sure you've tried to Google your name.
I've attempted to, and I can't get to it. Pages and pages and pages now. That's right.
When one of our other colleagues and friends, Tim Quick, has been on a couple of times, investigator for the State Attorney's Office, a fellow NCIS special agent.
Indeed. Yeah.
We were able to go back and find some quotes in old newspapers from Tim and from some images. When you have a name like Tim Quick, it's a little easier to Google than when you have a name like Tom Brady. And don't think that putting Thomas Brady matters at all to Google.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to wrap it into forensics, I have actually tried to Google. I've tried to Google myself many times, and I do that periodically. When I was a private forensic consultant, and even with NCIS, I would Google my name to make sure that there was no, from past testimonial experiences, there was no bad dirt out there.
Right.
So because as an expert witness in forensic science or in criminal justice as a whole, your reputation is sacrosanct.
Yeah.
So I would often always be amazed, never not amazed at how much data is out there about us and about cases, but also about the individual who is imparting that data.
Yeah. So
thankfully, I'm not always pleased with what I say on the backside, but thankfully, knock on wood, I survived, and in the purity of truth and being objective. The accurate portrayal of my testimony always was at least pure on the internet. So hopefully that'll continue.
You may have tapped into something. If somebody wants to keep off the radar through the internet, you might want to legally change your name to someone famous.
That's right.
Make it much more difficult for anyone to find you.
Yeah, it lucks out. So Siri can't find me, and Alexa, so I'm tracking. I like it.
Oh, that's great. Well, tell us a little bit, Tom. You are retired NCIS special agent.
I am retired.
Spent
Absolutely.
24 years as a federal agent, doing forensic science.
I started off like all NCIS agents back in the day. I'm dating myself, but it is what it is. I got on board along with my colleague Tim Quick. He was ahead of me, but I got on board in 1989. And what drew me to investigations was actually reading some old police novels, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
My brother would leave around the house, and he's a retired NYPD officer.
Okay.
So Joseph Wambaugh was the actual name of the author, and it just intrigued me. And when I was in high school, and then I was in the service, and then after that was introduced to NCIS at a job fair of all places.
Oh, really?
And it was kind of a funny story because the recruiter was there for 5 minutes, talked to me, and then had to go on a case she was called upon. So I had a tidbit of information, and I thought, wow, these guys, I could either take that as they dismissed me or their job is really exciting.
Right.
So I followed through and got on board as an investigator. And with NCIS, you do general crimes. There's a lot of specialties, but back in the day, it was kind of one man, one suitcase. If you know, kind of like Texas Rangers. You know, one ranger, one case or something.
Truck
you
and
know,
that's
right. You know, your camera, your fingerprint kit, and your notepad.
Yeah.
So in the old school ways, if you will, that worked because resources and expectations for outcomes were different. But nowadays, that would never fly.
No.
So I got really hooked on forensics from dealing with death cases in that singular mode from NCIS. If you were out of our basic training program within a year or two, perhaps, like I think 3 years later, I was overseas and working death cases by myself. Right. So if you go flashback to say a local police department or in a larger jurisdiction, perhaps you're not really getting that exposure that fast.
No, yeah.
So
you spend 3 years on patrol before
absolutely.
Even...
So the investigative side has always been an interest, of course, but it was the and not to dramatize this because of the popularity of the TV shows, but the walking into a homicide or a death scene and seeing the body as a piece of evidence and as a vessel, it's absent life. And the fact that body was entrusted to me to collect, document, process with the medical examiner. I just took to that, and I found that it just, for lack of a better word, I've never really described it as a calling, but it just fit for me.
Yeah.
And the level of detail that was required to be a successful death investigator intrigued me. And I had that skill set, though I didn't recognize it.
Right.
And it was developed over, of course, you refine it over many years. But I started off very happy with the old police work, the investigations, working property crimes, burglaries, sexual assaults, person crimes, and then there's nothing like. I hate to say nothing like a good death investigation, but when I mean good, I'm very cognizant that there's a victim, but I'm also I mean good as in challenging. It's good pure work.
Yeah. Well, that you can't control people killing other people, but on your side of it, you can actually have some say in finding a cause and resolving a case and holding someone accountable.
It's TV shows, everybody's intrigued by this, but what people often forget is that there's a face, there's a life, there was an existence with a family structure and friendship of others.
There's a whole ripple effect of
the ultimate crime is homicide. Yeah. So it does tend to resonate, and you take your job very serious and try to do your best for those that are left behind.
And you hit on something that, to be good at your job, you have to be able to, specifically your job, you have to be able to compartmentalize that and be able to recognize that victim's body as a vessel. And while you acknowledge the emotional impact that others are feeling, you kind of have to separate yourself from that, don't you?
Well, I think others, and again, I always like to separate the conversation about the popularity of TV shows like NCIS and CSI, where it's very appealing. They make it look very physical evidence is very appealing, and it's always an exciting job. But the compartmentalization,
they don't show the hours of sifting through,
or the smell, the senses, the grief, the autopsy, just the sanctity of the autopsy suite, if you will. But I would imagine from my experience, because when I teach now full time at Keiser University, my students come obviously with intense interest for this career field and forensics investigations.
Some of them probably got that watching TV.
Exactly. So I really don't have a story for anybody. I've never had dreams. I've never had nightmares. I've never been really on a mission. It's hard to describe. It just worked. It was my passion.
Right.
And I appreciated it. But again, it was a job. It was a career that I took very seriously. But I never really had to compartmentalize it. It almost was on autopilot for me.
Yeah.
And
it fits your skill set.
That
like
helped.
You said.
Yeah, that helped me be
obviously
successful. Probably because I just moved through it.
Yeah.
Whether it was a child, a person that looked like one of my family members, or as my kids got older.
Right.
It never, that part of it never resonated with me. It was always this is forensics. It's my job, and let's go do it.
I've got a job to do. Yeah, and I guess now being a professor and teaching this science, I'm sure you've had situations where somebody realizes they're not cut out for that.
Oh, very great. Yeah, excellent point. Yes, there is. Thankfully, with our program at Keiser University, and then just the way the job market is nowadays in criminal justice and forensics, there's obviously other opportunities once you get your degree. But yeah, we certainly have people when they go to the autopsy. We have an arrangement with the medical examiner's office here in Jacksonville through an educational experience that they help us with. And yeah, some students do extract, but I have to say the majority of them that are attracted to our program stay.
They know what
and
they're
they really
into.
yeah they probably put some more on a seriousness footing.
Yeah.
And it does take the drama out of it from the TV perspective.
Right. Well, yeah, look, and I want to give a little bit more background for you because you've done some pretty amazing things. You've traveled the world. You've handled death investigations in Afghanistan with NCIS. You've
Yeah, it was a seat of your pants. Good stuff, and it was from a team perspective. I certainly didn't solve the big one alone, and that's why I like forensics and the purity of it, and if you're objective in your processes and your interpretation of physical evidence and the totality and context of the scene event in concert with many other contributors, I think the process is well served, and it's not a table for one. It truly is a team approach.
Yeah, and forensics, the word forensics encompasses a lot of testing and techniques, the scientific,
Correct.
So explain that a little bit. I mean, like, for instance, when you're teaching,
Sure.
What specific sciences do you get into as far or evidentiary techniques and tests do you
great
focus
question.
on?
Just to go back the crime scene, the shows has done one thing for education in the profession. It has made colleges throughout the country develop these programs. Keiser University has maintained, because we are constantly adapting to what the employers in our community and around the state of Florida need.
Right.
So if our main externship site for our students is Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
Right.
So we invite them to be members of our advisory board, the Florida Highway Patrol, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Medical Examiner's Office, contributors that come and go, but give us information about what they're looking for in the ideal applicant. And one thing that is interesting, and this bears fruit even out of Florida from my colleagues that are in crime scene across the nation, if you will, there's an expectation from the employer for students to come very well educated for an entry-level crime scene job.
Yeah.
Part of that process is having a holistic approach to the forensic sciences. Keiser, we do not have a forensic science program. We have a forensic investigations program.
Okay.
But we do speak to and have subject matter like forensic chemistry, forensic biology, forensic anthropology,
Okay.
as well as advanced chemistry, physics, and biology for our students. So we're trying to give them that, and statistics as well. We're trying to give them that very holistic approach to be competitive in this what has become a very demanding profession.
Yeah.
It is not.
Well,
it's not TV. You're held to account.
And I mean, an investigation can really only be as good as the kind of collection, that crime scene, that initial
right. And I have a phrase. I don't remember where I got this, and I've seen it written down in other places. But garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
So bad data in, bad conclusions out.
Right.
And a lot of that data has to be self-policed. If you're by yourself, so we're in a room here. So if an event happened and somebody died in this room, and your teammates, if you will, are in the kitchen or in another bedroom, so you're the sole investigator in this room, and you're tired, you're fatigued, and you're self-policing. You've got to check the refrigerator, the drawers. I used to, when I trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, I would tell new investigators, crime scene types, that think about the decision making and discretion you have. People expect you to go that one step further, but you have a tremendous amount of discretion not to.
Right.
So it's
nobody's hovering over you saying.
So do I look in that cabinet? It doesn't look like it's been open for a while. So some investigators may dismiss it. Hopefully, all of them will reject that and open the cabinet. But you get there through training and experience, and that's why I think education is so important for the college student who is entering this field, and I've been doing this now over 30 years, and I still read, I still digest forensic articles.
Yeah.
I'm active in it, as you know, with the
Absolutely.
state attorney's office
Right.
here, thankfully. So I'm very aware that I could be one decision away from a bad conclusion. So
Yeah.
I try to very much peer review and self-police.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because it just start. There's a start, and if you don't put all of that effort into the beginning, you don't get that result.
And again, the garbage in, garbage out moniker, may seem kind of simplistic, but truly it is. It's data. It's information that needs to be assessed, and once it is assessed, you push it aside and maybe not forget about it, but maybe it goes into this column of not a hot lead. Where if it's forensic, because forensics may take months, years to get back.
Well, that's what I was going to say. One thing we're discovering now is, cold cases are being solved a lot of times because a crime scene investigator collected something at the time that had nothing, you know what I mean? They didn't know there would be DNA. They didn't know there would be fingerprints. Technology would advance. And we just see that by the luck, good,
well, we like to think a thought process by the individual, but all of us have done stuff and always thanked ourselves, like, I'm glad I did that. I don't know why.
Yeah, like, why in the world did that person pick up that, Coke can?
Absolutely.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But 30 years later, they did it.
And hopefully the police department still has it.
Right,
So,
right.
In cold cases, of course, the DNA is always on the forefront, right? DNA is the very appealing science, but it also can be a fingerprint.
Well, and to your point of starting, what'd you say, 89?
89 is what I started.
Early
my
90s.
Career, yes.
Like DNA wasn't what you
blood
were
typing.
looking for right then. Yeah, blood
Right.
typing. So, and that goes back to a lot of times blood was collected just to type it.
Correct.
And now, you know what I mean, they can do more with it if they,
if it's preserved correctly. So that is a cold case concern across the nation. But thankfully, a lot of successes have been born out of thankfully it's been preserved well.
Well, we know that medical examiners' offices for years have been taking blood cards.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
The
And
FDA
so
card,
sometimes your victim, you don't have that blood evidence, but we've had situations where they've reached out to the medical examiner and they go, we have.
Yeah, and that's funny because in my work with the state attorney's office, I have to most of the cases so far have been older cases for petitions for innocence. So we go back 80s. And you're actually trying to reconstruct not only witness recollections from the 80s, but also physical evidence status, right? So it takes an awful lot of time to find stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I probably annoy a lot of people in the various evidence rooms because we have to be so certain that if we have a DNA motion, a DNA petition, and there's a hope that there's a swab or a slide or a piece of clothing that has DNA that could in fact exonerate and put us in the focus of another subject. It's huge. So the human element is a big thing, and I take that very serious because I would hate to dismiss it at one step and then just not make that last inquiry. Because it's so powerful.
Right.
And you have a person that's incarcerated, I'm getting my coffee and walking the dog, and this individual's in a jail cell for what he thinks could be the rest of his life. So I
And
take that side of forensics
the
serious.
real killer.
And exactly, there's always
is
that
still out there.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
I was at a conference or a training recently, and they were talking about a case, and the actual crime scene investigator was talking about a specific case.
Sure.
And he was literally saying that there was an obvious point of entry through like a door that had like a sliding windows, like a storm door or something, and
Right.
excuse me, and there was a point of entry there. He was talking about taking an alternative light source or something, and literally like from the start at that threshold, like with a light source, like taking 45 minutes. You know what I mean? To
Yes,
try
I do.
to,
I do know what you mean.
to get 10 feet. You know,
you mentioned a colleague and the chief investigator, Tim Quick at the state attorney's office. You know, him and I back in the day worked, which is a kick in your pants to be working with him again in this capacity.
Yeah.
But we have some funny stories that we won't share. But
believe me, we've tried with him before.
But we've schlepped at scenes for hours, for a whole day. It was one shooting scene where we had it was a drive-by. Boyfriend of I guess the husband was shooting the boyfriend of a guy's, you know, the mistress and so on. So it was a shotgun. So we had a lot of pellets and wads and pieces of the ammunition that a shotgun shell, of course, has, right? And, you know, you go through the motion, and you're right, we go through, you know, each little step. And at the time, you may not realize the fruits of your labor,
Right.
as you mentioned. But down the road, even when you're, you know, not in that mode or not on that case, it may bear fruit. So humorously, we laugh at it and like, what were we thinking? But, you know, it really is, when you think about it, the right way to do forensic examination. You have to be tenacious.
It tells me, you know, that it really is a special person, you know, that has to do that
skill
job.
set. Yeah,
because
I would agree with that.
My wife would probably be a good, you know, evidence technician and forensic, because she's very detailed, and she will spend, you know, hours on the smallest little thing, where I probably wouldn't be so good, you know, but I recognize that.
That is interesting, because the majority of our students, and I don't have a metric for you per se, but I'm sure it's probably 98% in our program in Jacksonville are actually females.
Yeah.
And having worked in NCIS with a unit full of mostly females, the traits that you're describing are probably very true.
Yeah.
You know, the attention to detail, the patience. You know, it's not going to be a quick hit. You're going to need to just settle in and for the long haul and let it go
makes
about.
sense. You know, if we were to, I could tell you, I don't think my wife will be upset about this. If we were set up to clean our house, and you know, if she was just given an endless amount of time to clean the house, she would start in one corner and meticulously work. You know what I mean? Throughout no one would be like, if I were to clean the house, I would just, you know, grab everything and throw it in a box.
Cursory look.
Yeah. So that when you walked in, the house looked good. You know, I'd be done in 10 minutes, and it would take her months, you know, to get the house the way she wanted it. But
and I was working it was a bank robbery case overseas, and an old investigator that I was with was just adjusting to the role that I had at the time as a forensic consultant, and he was old school indeed. Now, old school, I will say also, old school is not, because I've been called that, and old school is not any sort of an insult.
Right.
It's just I'd like to think that new investigators, a new generation, can learn from old methods where we didn't have databases and all of this science, when we actually had to do the old, you really had to go out and meet people, talk to people, and investigate, right? But he threw out a saying that I used in teaching for many years, like, why don't we just throw some powder and move on? Like, his thought was like, why in the world are we doing all, like, why do you have your alternate light source out? Like, what are you looking for, man? You know, like, hurry up, it's lunchtime. But he wasn't that bad. It was interesting, because here it is, 2019, and you know, I came on board back in the day, right? So I've seen, pre-OJ and post-OJ. I hate to bring that up, but it actually is a marker in forensic science education and DNA in the country. And my students do great case studies on it because it is actually a very fascinating case, the DNA and blood portion, right? And the physical evidence side, not to mention the integrity of witnesses.
That was, pretty much the first
I think that was
criminal
the
case.
first national, the big, and then Barry, I think the attorney was Barry Schneck.
Yeah.
He actually was the founder of the Innocence Project.
The Innocence Project, right.
Which then was, now it's national. So
Right,
it's interesting. OJ was the gift that kept on giving for forensics and forensic education and rules and regulations and procedures, and nobody knew it at the time. It just was we've had enough of this.
You wonder what that case today, how
good
different
point.
it would have been.
How that was worked. That would
I spent
good point.
last week at a conference in Phoenix, and I've actually met Ron Goldman's dad.
There you go.
Fred, and I know Kim, his sister. I've worked with her on a couple things, and but comes up, obviously, and I've been listening to a podcast that Kim Goldman does called Confronting O.J. Simpson, and they have been going back and she has been interviewing. Yeah, current. Just it's
the wounds
going
are
right
still
now.
deep.
Yeah,
Yes.
but she goes back and she interviews Marcia Clark and the prosecutors at the time, the investigators at the time. She actually, in this last one I listened to, she interviewed two of the jurors.
Oh, interesting.
25 years later, and the jurors were saying things like, well, once one person lies, once somebody lies one time, and it was the evidence collection. I can't remember his name, but he was saying, I collected all the evidence, and the defense had pictures of subordinates collecting the evidence and then handing it to him.
I see.
He was not wearing gloves.
Yes.
So the defense attacked that portion.
He was. I remember him. It's funny you bring it up because for years I never forgot that man's name because I didn't want to be that guy.
Because you just don't want to be that guy.
But I did study his issues, if you will, and watched his testimony. And by the nature of education and my students being exposed to it, I kind of dove into it more than I would have liked to, if you will.
Right.
But there's a tremendous. I'd like to think in criminal justice and forensics in this country, I would like to think that those concerns now are gone.
Yeah, right. You
can't get your reputation. Integrity is sacrosanct. You have to testify under oath, and it's your livelihood. It's your job. So
we're talking about 25 years later. Thankfully, I guess we both forgot his name, but
it'll come to me though.
Yeah,
it'll because it was huge, and he just succumbed on the stand. I remember that, and though he maintained well, I don't know if he was employable after that. I'm sure. Well, in the time, maybe he was. Maybe
I
he
don't
was.
know, but you think about. I've sat in on a lot of trials, and when you get to the DNA portion of trials. Trying to explain it to a lay person, it can be challenging to not lose them in the explanation.
Right.
And if you could imagine being the first jury on the trial of the century, learning about DNA, having no knowledge of it, I can imagine it was a challenge.
I do remember that watching those, and it was 1995, right?
Yeah, I think
so. It is an interesting point. In forensic markers, in trial and testimony, and of course, unfortunately, the media and how that can help cases and also hurt them.
Yeah. Well, we see it, all the time because, everybody thinks that every case has DNA. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
they just think that there's a natural.
It's just going to be there, and you didn't find it. Say what, officer?
Right.
Or what do you mean you didn't get? There's no cellular material in this sample. He was wearing it for a week, and that unfortunately is probably the and there's papers on this that you may have heard about this, the Csi Effect.
Yeah.
Where juries expect too much.
Right.
And in fact, because when I have testified as a private forensic consultant, I was in a little bit more, and I mean this in a perhaps career-wise. I was post-career.
Yeah.
So I had a successful NCIS career. Was consulting privately. So if dare I say, the pucker factor had left me, and I learned to settle into my testimony. Now, plus, I'm sure I felt more confident in
Yeah,
my processes and my articulation of facts, and not overstating at the pressure of other dynamics. But I used to, as I said, testify. I would watch the jury when I walked into the room, and when I just would be very cognizant of their reaction towards my answers.
Right.
Where before, years ago, when I was new at this, if you will, I was so focused on not stepping on it myself. How do I look? Am I coming across like a federal agent, right?
Yeah.
But when I settled into my role and became a mature forensic consultant, I would really enjoy that aspect, because I it would be a great thesis for a PhD, because their behavior changed, like from a psychology perspective.
Yeah.
Like I watched, from slouching to this,
to
and to this,
note-taking.
and they really were. There was an expectation of delivering this information that they had been conditioned to expect from media,
and TV shows,
cases like O.J. Simpson back in the day. So great, very good point.
Yeah, it is interesting, and when you experience it, I know just enough to be able to follow. You know what I mean? Some of these conversations.
You probably know more. You probably know more than you realize, because you see it. You're
in
it daily.
Yeah. And I think. But I can see the glazed over look sometimes,
Well, DNA
is
it's powerful. It's powerful, and I'm constantly, matter of fact, just before you and I chatted on the phone earlier this morning, I had my head in something DNA related.
Yeah.
And I'm always I'm always making sure that my interpretation as a non-DNA examiner is pure. So the way I do that is I always go back to the DNA people, the forensic biology people, and they're more than happy. In my experience, I've never, they wouldn't be in a crime lab otherwise.
Sure.
But it's that interpretation, and that brings to an interesting point of for cold cases and physical evidence and DNA. It's the interpretation of that DNA, the context of where the DNA was found, that is now being scrutinized way past O.J. Simpson. So in 2008, there was the National Academy of Sciences report about, and they did a study, judges, law enforcement types, scholars, and they did a study on what was truly forensic science, the state of forensic science in the U.S. today. It was 2008, published in 2010, and it's available locally, or on a PDF, right? If you read that report and dive into it, the only true science in the author's assertion was in fact DNA. Which I find. I'm not in dispute with. I'm also, I also have been an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, shooting incident reconstruction. So I have thoughts about that too.
Right.
But on the DNA side, it is powerful. The statistics behind it and the error rates are well established.
Right.
And with that said, when there is no DNA, the response is, say what?
Yeah, it's
like excuse me, that's not how it's supposed to be.
Right.
But it does happen based off of the environment that it's in, right? The collection method, the storage method. You have to be pure with the concern of contamination.
Yeah.
And long-term storage, for freezing samples.
We talk to our families about this all the time, that the methods of today were not the methods of even 10 years ago, much less 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And you want to be frustrated, that evidence isn't there. But, in 1974, you know what I mean?
Right, I do.
They were doing
I do know.
absolutely the very,
Yes.
top of the line collection of evidence at the time, for that time.
And you bring up an interesting point, because back in the day, we look at older cases, and it's always good to look in the rear view, right, and be the one in authority, if you will, and not have anybody, everybody gets on the boat for criticism back of older cases, but a lot of it was not done out of ignorance or with malice. They weren't trying to railroad people. It's just they were using the technology and the training that they had at the time, and it was acceptable, and the bar. There's no doubt about this. The bar was extremely low.
Sure.
So, and also, which we can touch upon, but this is a dynamic in cases. the word of the police was a proven entity. The integrity, you took that oath. Nowadays, there is some would argue, a healthy disagreement with the police. It's my profession. I take like anybody in this job for the right reasons. They take integrity seriously.
Right.
And it always escapes me when I hear about bad cases, testimonial issues, right? Or prosecutorial misconduct issues that the Innocence Project states, right? Or testimonial issues. I when I'm on the stand, I would never, I'm focused in on what I did, I don't know where that thought process to lie under oath to put somebody away that you know is not guilty. It's an interesting. It's such a dichotomy for me because it's intrinsically wrong.
Yeah,
it is evil. It's
wrong.
There's
no justice.
There's no justice
in that. You know what I mean?
So that's another dynamic.
Right.
That I think we could explore.
We touched on the O.J. Simpson case, Mark Furman.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Without getting into that whole case, he the jurors that spoke on this podcast, they said, I couldn't believe anything that Furman came in contact with, had any association with, was out.
Damaged goods. And the defense did a beautiful job at impeaching him. You can get angry on that side, on the prosecutorial side of the fence, like, oh, that's irrelevant. But the defense attorney is trying, within the construct of the law, he's trying to present the best issue for his client.
And if you listen to what these jurors said, it was important. Like his credibility.
Oh, you mean they really assessed him?
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
that's
interesting. They said, how can I believe? Like maybe he didn't plant evidence. Maybe he didn't, conspire to frame OJ. But basically, I can't believe anything he said because he's a known racist, and what I mean.
So it damaged goods.
It was damaged goods,
and everything forward, they might have not even put him on the stand, because it was.
While the prosecution was saying, that part of it doesn't matter, the jurors were thinking otherwise. They were thinking it matters to me,
And therein lies the wonderful system we have in the United States, right? A jury of your peers. They're assessing. We think they're sleeping, but in fact, hopefully they're listening.
They
right?
are, I think.
Right? But that's something that I share with my students, because we do a mock trial episode, and we have a former assistant state attorney on our faculty, and he, as a lawyer, he does the defense. I do the prosecution. Yeah. And it's interesting as a non-lawyer, because he always shreds me. He shreds me. But unfortunately, he's not so much shredding me, but the students that I'm trying to save on our little mock stand.
Yeah.
But it makes our students realize that my opinions, my conclusions. Now, granted, if you're a crime, I won't say strike that, but if you are a crime scene technician and collecting evidence, right, your burden certainly, without argument, it can be at times less than, of course, the expert witness on the stand.
Right.
So we give them a taste of the expert witness, even though they're many, many years in education away from it, of that adversarial approach, because it's all fun and games, when you're on direct. And you're in your happy place, but it's once an astute defense attorney that has done his homework about you and your conclusions forensically. That's where the rubber meets the road. And I may add, why if you could probably do an internet search on this, where there's really not that many people, practitioners in these forensic science associations that are in my genre of crime scene reconstruction.
Right.
Because you have an awful lot of work to do to get it right, and it's that staying power that can be quite draining. Yeah. That could be quite a turnoff. Like,
sure.
Why
am I getting beat up? This is
exactly.
This is what I found through my experience, through my education, through my reconstruction, whatever it is. These are my findings. When you're an expert witness, you're giving an opinion.
A good point, and your opinion it should be challenged. challenge.
Sure.
And the way I always looked at it was, let me have instead of being adversarial with me, defense attorney or prosecution, depending on whom I was on at the time, why don't we have a discussion in front of the trier of the fact, judge or jury, and let them decide where we disagree, because I feel very comfortable in my conclusions, you feel comfortable in yours, but clearly we differ. So without too much moderation, let's get to the truth. And I think, and if I'm wrong, I'll no problem with that. I'll adjust. But the data that I look, my process may not have been wrong. I may have been led to a wrong conclusion for whatever, but I would submit that's where peer review comes into it, where you have somebody of equal or greater expertise actually act as your sounding board critically, and not just sign off on your work.
I always find it, seeing an expert witness testify, the strongest ones to me are the ones that it's almost like they don't care who's questioning them. These are my findings.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And whether that benefits the prosecution or defense doesn't really matter to me.
I
These are my findings.
Ryan,
and sometimes you hear them say things like, you probably heard this, like, well, is it possible? The attorneys will say, but is it possible?
Yeah.
It is possible. A lot of times they'll just kind of nod their head and go, yes, anything's possible, but it's not likely or it's not probable. That's
a good point. The old defense attorney, the questions, but I would actually, back in the in my career and work in private cases, I would enjoy that exchange, because I felt confident that I felt confident in where I was. Yeah. So, but if you're wrong, let me know about it, and if I don't have the data that you have, let's talk about it. And that's where, just as far as forensics and what has sustained me in it, is physical evidence doesn't lie. It's the interpretation of that evidence from the individual. And I think it has tremendous power in context. Back to the DNA, there's secondary transfer with DNA. Everybody talks about casual DNA and touch DNA, right?
Which sort of question we have.
Yeah, I saw that. Good question. But people always think, okay, so Ryan and I have deposited our skin cells, sweat here, and all that good stuff. It must be there. But what's the temperature between the time of deposit?
Do we have a vent blowing?
Exactly. What did somebody wash the table? What's on this substrate? Right. So that's
what material is this?
Absolutely.
Is it rough?
And
is
am
I
I dry and clammy, or am I actually
Did
you
lotion up before you got
here?
There you go. There's
burrito,
all these. That's right. There's all these factors, and we had some questions I want to get to, but I want to talk about reconstruction for a minute, because that's one of the things you have kind of specialized in. I don't know if that's an accurate statement.
No, that would be accurate.
Okay,
I mean, specialized in the sense that I did it for a long amount of time. I've training in it and published in it, and also, you get adversarially questioned, in front of a judge. So so that either a good thing or a bad thing, and it exists. So I've had to endure.
Well, so in your experience, this is there's technology out there now that is implemented in a lot of investigations that is like 3D scanning of crime scenes.
Yes,
I mean, so you went from, like, you probably had to get your tape measure out and and walk the room and measure where everything was and take photos of the placement of the chair, the placement of the bed, whatever that scene was, and just in your career, you have seen the technology advance from
absolutely
and Neanderthal pen and paper, tape measure,
old school, right?
To a 3D scanning, like drones and scanners.
Drones. Another. Well, it's all tools in the forensic toolbox. The 3D scanning is phenomenal, because 3D scanning can measure blood stains, angle of impact. It can actually measure angle of impact for bullet strikes on various substances, substrates, surfaces. So if you scan your scene, which I think most police departments in major jurisdictions, and I think most PDs have it, private consultants have them, colleagues I've worked with in the past are using them. Actually, at school, we've had them demonstrated, and it never ceases to amaze me because you're right. It's that one measurement that, for whatever reason, you don't get, but you need a year from now, and you have it forever memorialized.
Yeah.
Plus, you can import graphics to it. You can use it as a court demonstrative aid and exhibit. So the beauty of it is not only does it help. First of all, it helps the inquiry because all data is maintained.
Right.
Unadulterated, it's not corrupted. So it's right there. It's pure, as I like to say, right?
Yeah.
You can work on it then or later when you get more information.
Yeah.
And you can use it as a court aid for the trier of fact, right? So not only is it making scene documentation easier on the front end for the CSI types, right?
Right.
Us schlepping through the scenes in the rain and the heat and all that good stuff, right? Or if we're on a busy highway and we got to get out of there. It is preserving data that is pure for the process, and it's plus it looks good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the expectation. It is without a doubt the expectation in 2019 that I could not have a pen and paper sketch as an expert witness and then be up against my opponent who's got a beautiful scan.
Got a 3D, graphic.
I'd be in the coffee mess, doing my own thing. It wouldn't be a valid testimony, or I should say, it wouldn't be
credibility.
Perceived. Wouldn't be perceived as it.
I'm laughing because we had a case presentation one time, and it was a sketch of a mobile home trailer park, and it, with a stick figure victim diagram.
Boy,
and on the side it said not to scale.
And then on the side of that was burger with fries, please.
Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
we all, you can't defend that. We have a laugh about it.
Right.
But back in the day, if it's there's a rough sketch and then there's a finished sketch. And back in the day, they gave us classes in draftsmanship. Which I may add was one of my that and photography was my weak points. I never thought I was on a mission to correct the photography aspect, and I teach it now, advanced crime scene photography, and it's in my happy place. It's my easy skill set.
Right.
But I never mastered the sketch process. And thankfully, with NCIS, when we were doing heavy work in Iraq and Afghanistan and reconstructing major multi-fatality events, I had the benefit of a graphics specialist who was like my right hand in that.
Yeah.
And he did phenomenal things with the scanner that you're talking about, and it elevates your game.
It does. Technology is just the way it's moving, and what it's been able to do for crime scene, it just, and forensics, it's amazing. So we've touched on a little bit, you're part of the state attorney's office here has a conviction integrity review team.
Correct.
that goes back. It can be petitioned in cases where a defendant or an incarcerated individual has to be innocent. Like, you know what I mean? Like, can't say
it has to be a claim of actual innocence. You have to be able to articulate some initial facts that suggest that you're actually
you were wrongfully convicted.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a means for another appeal.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the appeals have to be exhausted.
Yeah. So you sit on that team, and there was an actual case that came to a conclusion earlier this year, where two individuals had been convicted of murdering one person and injuring another in a shootout in an apartment building.
Correct.
And you and a colleague did a reconstruction. Because the evidence, there was an eyewitness testimony that basically
that is the usefulness, the utility of crime scene reconstruction. So utilizing the physical evidence, the medical examiner reports, the scene diagrams, the laboratory reports based off of ammunition, firearms.
Right.
There was no DNA back in the day. Looking at all of that, you put it together and you get an event sequence together. So you basically what happened and in what order and what is supported by physical evidence. So you're not just coming to a reconstruction thought process because you say so. It is supported and bore out by forensic examinations where they existed, and also training and a reconstruction assessment and/or experimentation. This case was excellent because I actually got involved with this through Tim Quick before I was even affiliated with the state attorney's office. So he reached out to me as a private individual, and I was more than happy to help out.
Yeah.
And it was exciting because the case had teeth. The lead attorney is very dynamic, has tremendous experience. Whom is the division director. But what I found interesting about that process was the reconstruction element. There was an appreciation for it. So in other words, it wasn't just me saying this would work. People actually got it, understood it, and that, in a team approach, added more inquiry to the bigger forensic piece for this case.
Yeah.
So even though when I came in, the lead attorney, Shelley Thibodeau, had this read beautifully from her vast experience in defense. So she had this read beautifully. So it was, she would show me pieces of evidence, the window screen or something like that, or the glass on the bed, right, for example, or the suggestion of glass on the bed and how the blood stains were. And she had a thought process with other investigators in the office. It was, and it's fine to say that. It's just, how do we get there with a scientific process? How do we vet that properly in the totality of the scene? And that was the dare I say, the fun, a better word probably would be the challenging part of it.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of this event, the fact that this information did exist, and I was very pleased that I was able to add the reconstruction component from a qualified side.
Right.
That it actually bore out true conclusions that were helpful to the Conviction Integrity Review Division.
Yeah, and interesting enough in this case, this is one of those cases where should a 3D scan of the scene had been available back then.
Oh, that would have been. Well, that's interesting because if it had been available back in the day, the conclusions I would submit to you would be different.
Yeah.
So because the evidence would be there,
right.
the shooting position would be clearly demonstrated from a scan, and the body positions, because the pictures we had the bodies in place.
Yeah.
And I worked many death scenes over the years where the bodies were not in place, and when I now certainly you got in and out faster, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't help the evidence inquiry
Right,
process.
right.
So I would always try to get to the scene, as soon as I could. But of course, remotely with NCIS, we usually
you had to
could
be
not.
brought in
other
from
states, other countries, in theater. But having the bodies in photographs, and back in the day, I believe this was in the 70s.
The mid-70s.
And forgive me because I've worked quite a few cases since then.
No, this was mid-70s.
But the crime scene work and the verbiage that was used in the report actually was extremely helpful from the crime scene technician from JSO back in the day. I mean, they documented what they could. They may not have realized what the evidence meant back then from perhaps a training perspective, or it just wasn't
back then?
speaking to them in the spirit of the total analysis. But there was a lot of data in that old report that was obviously very useful for our purposes.
Well, and I think that back then the DNA of the time was eyewitness testimony, right? We didn't understand that eyewitness testimony sometimes they're a matter of trauma, shock,
absolutely, or condition. But think about you have somebody who's been shot by somebody else, and they tell you that they saw who the killer was, and I know who it is. What's to disbelieve?
Right.
It's right.
I'm sure at that time
back
that
in the day
was
it worked.
That was
check it off.
Yeah,
and let's move on.
Yeah, we don't need to do a whole lot more. We've got the best evidence at the time we could have.
Yeah.
But so interestingly enough, you didn't have a 3D scan. So you guys had to go out and actually go to a salvage yard and buy a steel screen that was from that time frame, because you're trying to reconstruct, and
we want to use the best evidence. We want to use the best comparison surface possible. So it's great that you brought that up, because again, we want to go, if we're going to do experimentation, it needs to be apples and apples, and not apples to oranges. So in this particular case, yes, we went to a salvage yard. We went through some window screens, and the state attorney's office purchased a window screen of similar size and construction. And we conducted a series of test shots through the screen at a
Using
range.
the same handgun
Same
caliber,
well, same
hand
similar
caliber.
handgun and a caliber of ammunition. Absolutely, I believe it was a 38 caliber
yeah.
revolver.
Well, let's show that picture, Clint. Well, people, on the screen there, you have the original crime scene photo
On the left.
On the left.
Yes.
And then this was your test on the right.
This
correct?
was our test on the right, and granted, when you look at the picture on the left, and it's not, if you just look at it and give it a casual glance, it's one thing, because our expectation is, the shooter shot through a window screen, right? So it's somewhat of a small caliber handgun, right? So what do we expect the hole to look like? And therein lies the problem. The expectation perhaps was a single hole, or several shots through a series of one or two holes, when in fact the stress of multiple gunshots through that steel window screen resulted in a larger defect, as conventional wisdom would suggest.
Right.
And therein lies a very simple experimentation, but it tested a witness observation, and it tested crime scene observation.
Right,
We have a hole in the window screen. Is it a hole in the window screen, or is it purely just a hole? Or is it in fact a hole from a bullet perforation? And this experimentation, as simplistic as it is to conduct, can also be argued it's simple to exclude.
Yeah.
Because, we all know what that looks like. But there's one thing that I've realized in forensic science is everything is not what it appears to be.
Yeah.
And you say it is, show me. And I used to say to colleagues years ago, bring me the rock and I'll fingerprint it. Like if it's not a sexy case.
Right.
Somebody threw a rock through a residence or through a vehicle.
Off a
well,
overpass
what
or
can we do with a rock? Well, no, it's in water. It doesn't matter. Let's see what we can do with it. So I've had tremendous successes, especially touch DNA successes. Not to digress out of this case, out of conversations and a thought process that. What hurts to? Okay, it's silly. You make fun of me when I leave the lab, but at least test it and see, given the magnitude of the case or the result potentially. So in this, the window screen was interesting. What I really would like to share with you on that, I don't know if you were going to go to the noise experimentation.
Good.
That was very interesting because there are pictures, as you can see. I don't know if it's still up here, but the one on the left, the bottom of the window is actually up a few inches, right?
Okay.
So we were able to scan that scene, if you will, and take some measurements from it as it sits today, all right, and replicate that with the window screen being up about that amount, correct?
Right.
And we went inside and did 2 gunshots inside with the same 38 that produced the gunshot defect for the screen. And we measured the sound, the decibels, right, with a noise meter over, not in the residence, but over at where the party for this particular case was being held, because that night the shooters were at a party, allegedly were at a party beforehand, or the 2 individuals that were accused of this crime were at the party. And there was a lot of people there, so could they actually hear gunshots that were from the inside, and or could they hear gunshots that were from the outside? So, long story short, you could hardly hear it even without the aid of, our noise meter, if you will, inside, which is interesting because the window's open, right? And now this was a quiet residential street, and it was 3 people from the state attorney's office, myself and 2 other people, listening to this, right? So with the noise meter, it registered, so we had a decibel output. And then when it was shot outside, right outside the window where the shooters would have been for this case, it was exponentially greater. I forget the meter number, but it was magnified.
Yeah.
Which support, that and many other factors supported our conclusion that the shooter was actually outside the window.
Yeah.
So to look at this case and dismiss it based off of singular components would not be just. I think you need to look at anybody if they are not a fan of conviction integrity review, and perhaps the fact that yes, we do have victims in this case. When you look at the reconstruction and the process we use behind it, there's a multitude of facts that come into the end result that supported, and this is the strength of this particular case. The reconstruction supported the traditional investigation of witnesses that still existed today and recollections of days past. So it was one component of the case. It wasn't necessarily the end all to save all. But it was a major piece, and it was good to see. I was very privileged and very excited to bring reconstruction in this fashion, because in my history it's always been to put people in jail for a long time, not to get them out.
Yeah, we talked about it. You know, justice is not putting the wrong person behind bars.
Absolutely.
I don't think
Correct.
victims, survivors. I think that we could all agree that we don't want just anybody put away for the crime. We want the right person put away.
Absolutely,
for the
in our
crime.
democracy, yes, we've got and we have to have accountability on the criminal justice side to do our due diligence to make sure that we do have the right person, and that's a whole different conversation on bias, confirmation bias, and checking ourselves as professionals with opinions and thoughts that we can't actually support.
Yeah. So we had some questions that came in, over the weekend, and you kind of touched on it. Touch DNA. We've talked about it a little bit.
Right.
We talked about grab that rock, bring the rock in, let's test it. Touch DNA is a kind of a newer technology in the last few years, and it's advancing rapidly. And getting more precise. The software that
smaller
that
samples
analyzes it.
Yes, absolutely.
Wendy Lawson, who commented on our post the other day, asked specifically about, is touch DNA a thing? Is there such thing? Yes, there is such a thing as touch DNA.
Or casual DNA was an earlier moniker of it.
And as you described earlier, there are so many factors as to whether you can
successful.
Collect touch DNA
Absolutely.
and test it.
Right.
That it would be irresponsible to say, yes, touch DNA is a thing, it's everywhere, and anybody should be able to collect it. I mean, that's just an irresponsible statement, as you already pointed out, touching the table and other environmental factors that could affect it.
No, I agree. It's just not. Yeah, it doesn't work like that.
Right.
In the pure sense.
So it's you got to kind of keep expectations in check, and in reality, touch DNA is a thing. Is it always accessible? Is it always available? Is it on every substrate that somebody touches? No. Are you going to be able to collect it?
You've
No.
explained it. I think I did take a peek at her.
Well,
that's very well done, Tom.
I know just enough. I know a little bit more.
No, you're absolutely right. The only thing I would add is it's the method of deposition, it's the pressure that's involved, it's the fabric and or the substrate, the surface that it's involved. I think Wendy had a particular question about touch DNA with clothing.
Yeah.
Short answer, yes. Right? Yes. But that's just as you mentioned, not to take up time on that, but the bottom line is there an expectation for touch DNA in a case where we know or suspect the suspect grabbed on clothing? Absolutely. The issue sometimes with that often is they're sampling, if the examiner is not sampling, say, the whole tremendous waistband, right, and all of that work that goes into it, and scraping the fabric, or however they choose to collect those that DNA material, they may in fact miss it. It may be, it may have, it may not have been in the spot where tested, so or in the quantities that were able to be quantified for a DNA profile. So I'm not a DNA examiner, so I won't get myself in trouble on that, but in the investigative mindset, are we in the investigative community and forensic community thinking about touch DNA? Absolutely. In the cases that I'm exposed to from colleagues, other agencies, investigators, non-forensic investigators, a good homicide investigators, right? They're thinking of this. They're going to conferences. This is a normal part of our vernacular, right? Sure. So where we used to have fingerprinting, I would be aghast to think that investigators and those in the know, attorneys, there's not an expectation for DNA. However, one must also be aware that it is not the save-all. It may not exist, but if we're thinking about it and always having the discussion and being open in the appropriate parameters to retest, right, or to revisit, and I think that's healthy. But also, for what I used to tell agents in NCIS in my role as a forensic consultant was, let's get the lab examiner involved in this, right? Let's get the actual people that are going to be doing the test involved in this, and talk about the case, case details that they need to know. We don't want to pollute the process, but let's just look at this logically, not emotionally. But I do understand with surviving victims, especially in where we sit today, that the expectation and the maybe the lack of success in that area can be tough to swallow, because there is such it's solvable if we can get it.
If we can get it, but it's not always there.
It's not always there.
Again, with my experience, if I pat you on the back here, for your job well done, could somebody collect that? Maybe not, depending on a lot of factors. My DNA.
Well, it was here we go. Very light touch.
Yeah.
You grab me in an assault,
right?
In a sexual assault mode, and you're doing this, or the victim is grabbing the suspect. Truly a clenched fist. Different deposition than just a casual
pat
brush
touch.
Off. That is skin cells staying. Some So it's an interesting thought.
And what I have seen where it's been successful is wear DNA. So not around my collar, under my arms, on my shirt. You're going to get, my DNA.
Long-term deposition, frequent deposition,
friction, rubbing in
friction,
the
absolutely.
those kinds
just
of things.
lots of dynamics that is.
We see it criminally. Sometimes it's been successful if in a robbery where the victim's pockets are turned inside out.
Very logical and common.
I know that's something that is looked at a lot in investigations. You find a robbery victim and their pockets are turned inside out. You want to try to see if you can get touch DNA, from those pockets. There's technology out there, MVAC technology that vacuums up, and basically
very
uses
successful
water.
For cold cases.
It has been successful. Now, what I have heard, some of the issues with MVAC is it's so good that you don't want to MVAC an entire shirt because you're going to get DNA from
That's
me.
Interesting. But MVAC has proven itself of value, and DNA is constantly being, in the private side of DNA. A lot of post 9/11 technology on the forensic side bore out of terror. The war on terror and biometrics and so on. So it is exciting to see the advances in forensic science. I'm convinced that before I give this up permanently, there'll be a little machine in a patrol officer's car. He'll see a speck of blood at a scene, and he'll collect it and put it in his little machine, write his report up, clear from the call, and he'll get his profile uploaded to CODIS. And they're working on that. Yeah. And I've read that in the mid-2000s, but the box was very large, and then over the years they small. Bigger car, right? So it's really exciting, and DNA is only going to get more discriminatory in the sense that the statistics are going to bear out for individuality, and it's almost like that Tom Cruise movie where there's I forget the name of it, but he was involved in pre-crime. And
Minority
artificial
Report
intelligence,
or something.
And I find that it's going to be an interesting how AI and the prediction. You talked about the pockets, right? The artificial intelligence side of predicting, through algorithms based off of what the victim said. For example, a little futuristic thought here, like where this particular perpetrator may have actually touched her. And then collect from there. Who knows where it's going to go? But it really is it's an exciting time to be involved in forensics.
I'm sure,
Good stuff.
And kind of a couple of more of Wendy's questions because she had a few of them. And again, I hate that sometimes these questions aren't a specific answer. I mean, when you're dealing with forensics,
Yeah,
it is
how's
very
our time?
specific.
Am I taking is it dinner yet?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of these answers would be specific to a case and to a situation.
Sure.
And
the in the spirit of that, having, and I talked about this earlier, having the context of evidence deposition or collection, you cannot overstate from a reconstruction mindset the context of back to DNA, because there's secondary, just because, for example, just to try to be succinct here, just because my DNA is in the scene of the crime doesn't mean that I did the murder. Like what is my association to this environment? Right. And if it's a public
your house?
there you go. Yeah. And if it's a public domain, what, instead of running down that rabbit hole, you got to look at the context of the deposition. Now, granted, a lot of times it's without dispute. Right. It is what it is.
By the time it gets to trial,
they've done their investigations, and the investigation is quite clear on who's who in the zoo. So, but on these true unsolved cases, as you know, these cold, they're not easy. Yeah. They're not easy.
They're cold for a reason usually.
And the passage of time, if it's tough from day one, imagine what it's going to be like at day, year 25, as you appreciate.
Yeah, sure. So, and this is kind of one of those questions. If a small amount of substance, a drop, is found on a suspect's vehicle, is there a way to determine, one, if it's blood, and two, if it's human blood versus bug blood or matter? So
I love this. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, the short answer is yes. And to expand on that a little bit, in the field, crime scene investigators can sample blood, a blood drop. Now, we've got to be very cognizant of this, because we're going to sample this for the presumptive nature of blood, and this is more than Wendy probably wants to know, but depending on the size, shape, morphology, the volume of deposition. But if it's purely, are we figuring out this is blood,
it blood or
right?
Not? Yeah.
And we're not overly concerned about DNA, for example. Yes, there's several kits in the crime scene investigator's toolbox that can find out right then and there if it's presumptive, if the presence of hemoglobin, that is our main component, right, that keeps us oxygen rich in blood, is in this sample. Yeah. To make that into bug spatter, right, or splatter, bugs actually don't have hemoglobin and don't have blood. So they have a substance.
Except for mosquitoes when
they suck us. Well, actually, that's another story, because that and the post-mortem analysis of bugs feeding on corpses is an interesting and has bore fruit about in toxicology. But in answer to Wendy's question, yes, you can figure out if it's blood or not. And you presumptively figure out it's blood. You get a swab for it. You preserve it correctly, and then it goes obviously to the lab for DNA. You've already done the presumptive test.
And part of that would be, how small an amount are we talking about?
Can we see it?
Yeah.
Is it diluted? Right.
Yeah.
So those I won't opine upon. There's good. Each kit has research very specific to that chemical that's used. But the bottom line is the presumptive testing for blood is so commonplace now that it's generally done in major scenes where you're trying to get away from not sampling too much blood.
Right, that's what I was going to say. You don't want to use up the sample finding out if it is blood and then not being able to actually test it for DNA.
Or for example, you've got a shooting and it's a shooting in the head, for example, or a beating, and there's a lot of blood in your scene, and do you need to sample all of that when it all appears to be the same
from the same source?
But her question is valid. If we're looking for, say, the blood of a killer that may have been deposited on the exterior of a car, yes, we could figure out if it's presumptive. In this particular case, if we can have some fun with it and suggest that this one blood drop was extremely critical, I wouldn't even presumptive test it. If it looked like blood and I thought this car was in the area of a potential suspect,
context.
I would swab it most likely, and then I would submit that
Submit
for DNA.
it for DNA.
Yeah,
And
be a
just
good
make the assumption based on context that
absolutely.
that is blood.
And appearance.
And then it's,
reddish brown, and as blood ages, it turns black. And depending on if it's a blood pool, you'll have serum separation, cerebral spinal fluid, so it all retracts.
Yeah.
So there's more to it, but it's interesting because blood sometimes is what you think is blood in a scene. There could be Coke, Dr. Pepper. There's other substances involved,
Right.
and generally. When you're doing this a bit, you can feel pretty good about it. But when it comes down to that one critical drop, always seize, always test. Let the lab have its say.
Right.
From the confirmatory side.
Yeah, exactly. And again, context. If you've got a spilled Coke can next to this drop,
I
know what I mean?
like
That's,
your example,
that's
Brian.
context.
Absolutely, that's context.
So,
that's bringing it in nicely. Absolutely.
So the other question that Wendy had was if a suspect is given a GSR test. I don't know how much experience you have with that. This would be on the end of the spectrum.
Residue.
I don't have much knowledge
we can,
at all.
We can talk about that because it does come up because GSR. If you wanted to read her question.
Yeah. So the question is, if a suspect is given the GSR test and it comes back positive, is there a way to prove that it was from gunpowder versus other reasons given, like handling fireworks or brakes, etc.?
Okay, good. Well, just sticking to the question in the spirit of time, yes, there is. Scanning electron microscopy is used nowadays, and it's an atomic. They're looking basically at the atomic structure of the sample, and in gunpowder, there's organic and inorganic metallic components, barium, antimony, lead, for example. You may find similarities in fireworks because it's a munition, it's a gunpowder. Brake pads that are non-ceramic, right? But where you can tell the difference is by the very nature of a scanning electron microscopy process, right? They are looking at it at the atomic level, and they are looking at the totality of the particles that are suggestive of gunshot residue. So they know the size, shape, and morphology of what a gunshot particle from this sample presumably would look like, right? And they're looking at it in totality with all the components together, not separately like you'd find in, the onesies or twosies, say, in brake dust. Yeah. So the short answer is yes.
But let me ask you this, and I'm going to go to the Csi Effect here because I have very little GSR experience, but I've seen some stuff on TV. So when she says test positive for GSR, I've seen them take swabs on TV of somebody's hand. Is that like a kind of like a presumptive blood test, or is because that's different than the microscopy, right?
That's what you may be describing or you may have seen is if it's a stub. If it looks like a thimble, if it's a stub like this, it is the collection of GSR particles on a hand, and these kits are self-explanatory. That's what I tell my students and what I was teaching at our academy. Guys, don't fret. Guys and gals, don't fret, right? You haven't done it for a while, you get it's a perishable skill set, right? So if you're the one empowered to go and collect gunshot particles, make sure you read the directions, because every box comes with it, right?
That's
every
good.
crime scene thing comes with
Yeah.
it, right? Luminol, presumptive blood test. Just take a moment, put the pride aside, and read the directions, right? I was that guy that I'd go and I'd get a moment and make sure I did it right, but it has saved me in the spirit of things. But the swab of old was an old paraffin test, an old chemical test. They're out completely. Okay. If it's a thimble and they're dabbing, because you dab it, you don't swab it per se. You're not rubbing
damage the particles.
That's the collection process for scanning electron SEM, scanning electron microscopy. So those particles, and they're separated from portions of the hand and also left and right hand. And the collector, right, the police officer, the lab component, has to wear gloves themselves. Right. And GSR is an interesting story because there has been some cases in the news down the road about how GSR has been the defining piece. But I think most people will tell you, again, you have to look at it in totality. Yeah. And the defining piece is, did they fire the gun? Were they around the firing of a gun, or did they come in contact with somebody who fired a gun? Yeah. So those three outcomes have to be weighed against other facts in the case. I've done experimentation on gunshot particle cases where GSR was very critical. some years ago, and I went to a lab and shot many ammunition, and we collected the gunshot particles from our test subject, and then looked at it that way, and then quantified it, and then testified to that amount. It really comes down to the weight of the evidence, and if the jury is going to agree to that sort of almost, I won't say non-scientific piece, because scanning electron microscopy is science, right?
Atomic
but it's
levels
the interpretation of it that sometimes gets deflated.
Yeah.
And you have to interpret it correctly. Dare I say again, in the totality of the event.
Yeah. So the answer for Wendy is that yes, they should absolutely be able to tell the difference between break, dust.
Yes, chemically the
fireworks,
components may be similar, but they're different.
Absolutely. And on an atomic level, that's
it's
interpretable.
Yes, simply stated, yes. I think we brought that in.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to add other than GSR is it's just not defining. And I don't have an example for you where it was. And you can hear people talk about GSR in these, if you see testimony, and you go, man, that's interesting. That sounds serious. And then you'll hear the opposing side present it, and you go, man, I'm glad I considered that too, because there are exceptions. Yeah. Not to be excluded, but from a scene or consideration, but it certainly isn't in the nature of our DNA conversation. For conclusionary, identification.
Well, Wendy, first of all, thanks for those questions.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks. That was
sometimes we do think about forensics as DNA only. Yeah. And there's so much more, to what you're teaching and what these, crime scene investigators are collecting. And
I would say this, Ryan, in totality, forensics is not a highway to the end without a good investigation to get you there. And you got to apply, it's just good investigative practices, a logical application of leads. It's not done in a vacuum. You're on major homicides, of course, you're talking to prosecutors, you're talking to your lab people, right. You're talking to
team approach forensic, you keep talking about,
and there's nothing like an experienced homicide detective or investigator that have worked cases, cold case or otherwise, over the years, which you've had on your show and you're associated with at conferences, a lot of mutual acquaintances of ours, right? And it's just the investigative piece. Forensics is very appealing, but you got to get there by a very solid investigation.
I really appreciate you coming out, Tom. This has been
pleasure.
I mean,
my pleasure.
I love this stuff, and I think we did a really good job today of showing the complexity of an investigation and the moving parts. I mean, we focused on forensics.
We
barely.
did. We covered some ground. We covered some ground.
But an investigation, that's just one of the components that goes into an entire investigation. We talked about context. We talked about, we didn't
collection,
examination. We didn't get into
interpretation,
witness interviews. Really, you know what I mean, and the other parts
which
that
is
go
another,
on.
Which is a whole separate dynamic.
So. But I mean, was there anything you wanted to make sure?
No, I'm just very happy to help you in Project Cold Case. I appreciate what you're doing, of course.
Well, thank you, Tom.
I know your story, and it certainly was impactful to me, and we've known each other now for a bit. Yeah. But no, I'm glad there's an interest in forensic science and the logical application of it. Yeah. Doing this for a while. The fact that it is being criticized on a lot of levels, it's not as pure as it once was, isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a lot of hype behind some of those comments from some detractors, but I'd like to think that those that are in this, for the long haul, will see that, it's not a soundbite. We should be open to improvements and an examination of our process, but from the reconstruction side, the joy of it for me over the years, just to conclude, has been not only working with the Conviction Integrity Review Division, which is I never saw myself, not to be cliche-ish, if you will, but to giving back. Like I never saw myself in that role, but it's one I've embraced. it's nice. It's a good feeling to be able to have worked and to maybe be on the latter side of things now. Post career, if you will.
Right.
To have this application to look at older cases and see if there is some merit to these petitions and bring modern day forensic science and interpretation to an outcome that may be extremely well received by those that are
need it
hoping
the most
for it. Yeah.
On two sides there, on others. But thank you for all you do and for teaching our future.
Appreciate it. Keiser University. Absolutely.
I've come out and spoke to your class.
Yes, we'll have to do it again. That was
again.
Very appreciated, very well received as well. It's good to get the word out.
It is always good to get out and talk to students. We have partnerships with UNF, with Keiser, with and sometimes it's forensic, sometimes it's
CJ.
general criminal justice,
Sure.
and sometimes it's journalism, because we do with a lot of media, and believe it or not, educating
I
them on some of the trials and tribulations of being victims and survivors, and is important too. And I again appreciate you coming, because one of the things I want to do, it's important to me, is to just educate. When I to get to the seat I'm in now, I just wanted to be in the room with people that knew things I didn't know, and I wanted to just absorb as much as I could and learn as much as I could. I was able to recognize that I didn't know everything about an investigation. I had no connection to law enforcement investigations before my dad was killed.
You've done well. I mean, you're right in the fold now.
Well, sometimes it's best to just listen to the
Sure.
people that have the experience and know what they're talking about, and I like to share that with others, because I think that knowledge is power. And
absolutely.
And if you're ever going to find yourself having a conversation with the detective in your loved one's case, or the prosecutor in your loved one's case, have this information at your hand so you can ask
very well.
Ask important questions.
It's powerful.
Yeah, it really is, and we want to give as many people that information and education as we can. And you provided a lot of that today, so we may have to do a follow-up. We'll see how many questions we get.
Yeah,
but
very, very happy to do it. I can talk about it, of course, for a long time. It's what's part of my DNA, dare I say.
Right,
so right. It is what it is, and I appreciate it. And thanks for having me.
All right, well, great, Tom. We'll have you back again another time and get into something maybe a little more specific. But thank you all for tuning in, watching. Remember to share this. I tell people all the time, our little catchphrase here, we don't need to reach 1 million people, we need to reach one, but we may have to go through 1 million people to get to that one. And part of that is liking and sharing our posts on social media. And we're going to go through some of our cases that are kind of anniversaries of this week coming up. And we want to share those with you and make sure that those families know their loved one is remembered and not forgotten. And if you have any information on those cases, please reach out to the law enforcement agency involved. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.